Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to what is our keynote address for this, not necessarily coming at the start of the talk, but in the evening, which we thought would be a good time to have this. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Richard Hildreth from the University of Oregon. Dick and I go back a ways and have known each other for several years, so it's really nice to see him here, coming from the University of Oregon out to Oregon State University territory. It's funny because Dick is actually one of the ducks who is welcomed with open arms at Oregon State University, and he regularly, because we lack a school of law, our marine resource management program depends upon him very, very heavily to provide a lot of the policy and legal issues associated with their coursework. So he does a great job for some of our programs here at the university. He has been at the University of Oregon since 1978, and he and I probably crossed paths without knowing it, because before then he was a professor at the University of San Diego, where he got his dose of marine things by going to the TGIFs at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is a place I frequently hung out as a graduate student at the same time period. He's had a very distinguished career, presently a full professor of law. He directs the Ocean and Coastal Law Center at the University of Oregon. He knows about a lot of the things that we're dealing with here because he is on the Minerals Management Service Advisory Panel for the Science Board for the Outer Continental Shelf, and also serves in Oregon on the Science and Technical Advisory Committee for the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. So he has been off in Hawaii for a 4.5-month stint on sabbatical, where he's been working on a variety of issues related to ocean zoning, including things related to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the designation there of what's effectively the largest marine reserve in the world, I believe. So it's a real pleasure to have him give us a talk today dealing with ocean zoning and the potential effects it could have on wave energy issues. So, Dick Hildreth.
Thank you, George. And I will start with a huge thanks to the steering committee, including George, Greg, and others for giving me this opportunity to speak about a very timely topic that is being wrestled with both at the national level as well as the state level in Oregon. And as luck would have it, when George called, I had just put in one of the most focused research efforts of my career, looking on a global basis at effectiveness of marine protected areas and the laws behind successful marine protected areas. And I hope to get that manuscript out for peer review and published in the coming months. I must admit I'd been more following the wave energy scene, including the legal side, but this invitation to meld the two launched me on an intense month-long catch-up effort to match what I knew about MPAs and marine reserves with the wave energy scene. Now, George said, would you speak about ocean zoning? And that may be a bit unfortunate among the possible synonyms that are used to describe what I'm calling in my forthcoming article, place-based ocean management. In our textbook, we call it area-based ocean management. And I've seen the term in the literature, marine spatial planning. And yes, in the literature, there may be debates about differences among those, but at least for tonight, I'm treating those four labels as more or less the same. And then I'm also assuming that within ocean zoning, most of us at least would include as techniques or tools marine protected areas and marine reserves. And the focus of my remarks in the end will probably be trying to think hard from where I sit about the melding of the marine reserve concept with wave energy development. And I welcome your comments about whether that was the appropriate emphasis or not, because I plan to stay with the issues of both marine protected area management and development and wave energy development as well. And I sat in on the fisheries receptor breakout group this afternoon, and Dave Fox, among others, talked about de facto MPAs resulting from decisions to permit wave energy development. And I think I would agree with that, and I would just add from my perspective tonight, so do we need zoning before wave energy development, or can we catch up later with appropriate zoning, whatever that might be, after wave energy development has already occurred? And I will work my way back to that question as kind of my final conclusion, which I should emphasize is really my personal analytical opinion at this point, not the opinion of any of my affiliated positions, either remunerated or volunteer at this point. Now, one thing I learned from the discussion this afternoon was that maybe it would be helpful for me to emphasize the difference I think I see between the broader MPA, Marine Protected Area concept, and the, if you will, narrower marine reserve concept, the no-take zone concept, which has become very prominent in fisheries management discussions. As to what an MPA is, as far as a definition, I'm going back to President Clinton's Marine Protected Areas Executive Order of 2000. Marine protected area means any area of the marine environment that has been reserved by federal, state, territorial, tribal, or local laws or regulations to provide lasting protection for part or all of the natural and cultural resources therein. So it's a broad, multiple use umbrella. The narrower concept of marine reserves is basically a particular ocean area where no extractive activities are allowed. A much tighter control, if you will, on both exploitation of living resources as well as non-living resources in the reserve. And I think what we see out there, both globally, nationally, and on the West Coast, is what I think is at least sometimes suitable use of both of these types of ocean zoning. And I will hope to briefly take us through, if you will, a bit of the background, especially of West Coast ocean zoning, but starting much closer to home with the figure that you have as you turn through my handouts. The United States Exclusive Economic Zone, the world's largest, 200 nautical miles offshore. And the next two figures come from the USCOP report showing the multiple use management issue. So this is off New England, drawn from the report, and maps, and then even in the paragraph below, demonstrates for this busy part of the New England coast what those multiple uses that need to be managed might be. And then from an article in Science, got permission to use the next figure about the busy offshore area in Southern California. So people look at information like this, and that's where the suggestion then begins that we need for the United States Exclusive Economic Zone, at least for some areas, the application of what we might call a zoning scheme, including both marine protected area areas as well as marine reserves. So, I've had the pleasure on 2 sabbatical leaves of focusing on the Great Barrier Reef and how that Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is managed. It was probably Exhibit A, if you will, in marine protected area law and management circles until President Bush recently proclaimed the Northwest Hawaiian Islands Marine National Monument. And out at the University of Hawaii for 4.5 months, I tried to track down, especially from the legal paper trail side, as much of the documentation as what George now calls the world's largest marine conservation area. Some are saying it's the world's largest conservation area, terrestrial or marine, in area. Now, the Great Barrier Reef and the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, coral reefs, an important resource. MPAs and marine reserves have probably been established in reef environments longer than anywhere else. Obviously, we're not in a coral reef situation on the West Coast, but nonetheless, we have MPAs in existence, and we even had proposed in 2005 by Governor Kulongoski of Oregon, writing to the Oregon Congressional Delegation, proposing that Congress designate a large marine sanctuary under federal law off the Oregon coast. Now, George mentioned the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. Their recommendation as of about a year ago was to go slow, if you will, on the idea of a national marine sanctuary. And so at the state level, right now, there is more immediate focus on the marine reserve concept. But I've been told by staff from the governor's office that they view this as still on the table, not off the table. If we did get a national marine sanctuary off Oregon, the next figure shows you the existing national marine sanctuaries in the United States exclusive economic zone. The next figure shows 5 of them on the West Coast, with the Olympic Coast Sanctuary off Washington and 4 sanctuaries off California. And the next table, Table 1, courtesy of Steering Committee member Greg McMurray and his work for OPAC, shows you the type of regulations of activities that occur in the National Marine Sanctuary System. So if we did have a National Marine Sanctuary established off Oregon, this illustrates what that would mean, especially from a legal regulatory perspective. And this is where I begin to think about wave energy development and how it fits in or doesn't fit in, if you will, with emerging trends to establish marine protected areas like marine sanctuaries and also marine reserves, either as part of marine sanctuaries or freestanding reserves. Congress, in the 2005 Energy Act, basically prohibited renewable energy facilities from being established in federal waters of national marine sanctuaries. So that's a zoning out, if you will, excluding the possibility in federal sanctuary waters at the legislative level. And frankly, preparing for this presentation has begun my thinking about whether that was a bit of overkill, if you will, and that we might someday want to readdress whether there's a way to fit in renewable energy development within sanctuaries rather than the current blanket exclusion. But as a law person, when you go looking for bright line instructions about appropriate and inappropriate ocean uses, you come to that very quickly. The other thing I would say is that all the sanctuaries, as illustrated in Table 1, regulate construction on sanctuary bottomlands. That's, if you will, the column to the right, general regulations and prohibitions that are prevalent in most, if not quite all, of the sanctuaries. The interesting technical point there, those regulations also extend to state ocean waters that happen to be a part of the National Marine Sanctuary. So if you follow the technical point I'm making, a moment ago I spoke about a congressional blanket exclusion of renewable facilities in the federal waters of a sanctuary, and the less onerous regulation of them in the state waters. So I think we would see then a response from wave facility developers to perhaps stay away even from state sanctuary waters and seek places where there is no applicable zoning. So we then can proceed to ask a few more questions about the marine sanctuary system, and I've included in your handouts the Olympic Coast Sanctuary from the Northwest. There's wave energy potential off Washington, and so it would illustrate the point I was just making, that right now we have a blanket congressional exclusion from federal approval of renewable energy facilities in the federal waters, beginning basically 3 nautical miles offshore, and within the state sanctuary waters off the Olympic coast, these bottom protection regulations would be applied to wave facilities locating there. Now, I would characterize most of the national marine sanctuaries as being the broader marine protected area type of marine zoning, but 2 sanctuaries do have marine reserves within them. So I included the Florida Keys as an illustration of the nesting of no-take marine reserves within a broader national marine sanctuary. And if we imagined someday that there is a national marine sanctuary off Oregon, maybe there would be within that sanctuary nested marine reserves as well. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary is your next figure. Very interesting from a governmental legal perspective how the state of California worked with federal sanctuary managers to come up with matching marine reserves in state and federal waters. The state's marine reserves were established in 2003. The federal matching reserves were established in August 2007. So here, along with the Florida Keys, is an illustration of the nesting of these no-take areas in sanctuary state and federal waters. And again, it's a model, if you will, for how MPA management is evolving in the United States. Now, there's been a lot of coverage recently of the California marine reserves and MPAs being established in state waters up and down the central California coast. And that probably under California's Marine Life Protection Act, especially for the West Coast, is the legislative model, the process model for how closer to shore in those state waters extending out to 3 nautical miles, networks of marine reserves are being established and may be established off Oregon and Washington as well. That's basically, I think, an overview of the marine zoning scene as I have seen it unfold so far. I'd now like to emphasize even further the consideration of wave energy development within that picture. And I've imagined, for tonight's purposes, 4 basic ocean zoning scenarios with respect to wave energy development, and you don't have a figure illustrating these points. Scenario number 1, wave energy development is zoned out by a particular zoning scheme, and I guess the handiest example would be in federal waters of national marine sanctuaries, a congressional decision in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. Scenario number 2, wave energy development is zoned in as a favored energy alternative to fossil fuels, for example. I have not found in my work an example of an explicit zoning in of wave energy development, but if you know of one or find one, please let me know. I'd like to add it to this emerging picture. My scenario number 3, a current ocean zoning scheme does not mention wave energy development either positively or negatively. There is a zoning scheme, but nothing is really indicated at all about wave energy development within the zoning scheme. And finally, there is a 4th scenario, which is quite prevalent on the west coast of the U.S. There is right now no applicable ocean zoning scheme. So, what would one suggest briefly about future developments in this area? Well, I think we can take a policy perspective on energy policy bases and suggest that at least from some perspectives and evolving out of this workshop with respect to ecological impacts, that we might want to work hard, if you will, to fit wave energy development in wherever possible. At least assuming that for purposes of discussion, I went to work sort of imagining what I thought would be the hardest case in today's marine protected area, marine zoning environment, and that is to contemplate from a legal perspective, would wave energy development even fit into no-take marine reserves? And that's where the handouts plug in again. I have this textual one, types of activities prohibited marine reserves. And almost all federal and state definitions of marine reserves exclude extractive activities. From what I heard today, sitting in on the fisheries group and the reading I've done, I would not characterize wave energy as extractive. So as a performance standard to be met, I think wave energy could fit in to marine reserves. Now, I've quoted, these don't have legal status, but these are sort of other performance standards of a general type that you find used in defining marine reserves and what are the prohibited activities. Activities that remove or disturb living or non-living marine resources. That's from the National Research Council. The Clinton Executive Order on Marine Protected Areas talks about ecological reserves where there are no consumptive activities, consumptive. The Pew Oceans Commission recommended that marine reserves be established and that activities that upset the area's natural ecological functions not be allowed. Again, as a listener in the fisheries session, maybe we're approaching having to measure some of the potential impacts of a wave energy array, plant, or park, depending on which term you favor, against that standard if it were the governing standard. Right now it's just in the Pew Oceans report. Change the dynamics of the ecosystem. That is in law in the Marine Life Protected Act. The marine reserves established under that California law do not allow activities that change the dynamics of the ecosystem. Again, listening today, maybe some impacts might change the dynamics depending on how we define and implement those terms. So I don't see necessarily that wave energy development is obviously going to be zoned out even of marine reserves, but there may be some close questions if, and this is a big assumption in my work, that there might be places where there might be reasons to have a marine reserve, but it also might be viewed favorably for wave energy development. Finally, and this is the one update that I'm aware of since I put this together, October 9th in Salem, the State Land Board adopted the language that's quoted at the bottom of this handout in the state's approval of renewable energy devices in state waters. It shall not be approved if it substantially impairs lawful uses or developments already occurring within the area. So there's an operative legal benchmark that will now be applicable in the state approval. So if we finally come to unzoned areas, that's my scenario 4. I was just working through in lawyerly fashion, can wave energy even fit into areas zoned as reserves? Now we turn to the roughly 50% of West Coast waters that are not zoned. And I see 2 basic legal points I'd like to make. I don't find in applicable law today at the federal or state level any requirement that ocean zoning be in place as a precondition of wave energy development. So it can proceed in areas unzoned currently. On the other hand, I also see that there is capability up and down the West Coast for further ocean zoning to take place, either under state or federal initiatives. So I then see finally my ultimate policy question for tonight. How should any new West Coast zoning scheme address wave energy development? And I think for a case study, we can use Oregon, because the next figure is this schematic of the Oregon offshore, where the only thing that we might describe as zoning, I think, comes through the fishery management process. So I've included in black and white an essential fish habitat map for the West Coast, including Oregon. And then within essential fish habitat, there are habitat areas of particular concern. So to me, off Oregon, that is the closest existing thing to zoning. And then I include from the Eugene Register Guard a recent article about an Australian initiative to develop wave energy. And we have then this diagram of the type of facilities that one entrepreneur might propose to bring to Oregon coastal waters. And from where I sit, it reminds me of the fiber optic cable landings issue that was dealt with through legal and managerial processes of the state. So here is a map of fiber optic cable landings included in your handout to show that, yes, this new ocean use arrived. There was controversy about fisheries displacement. Compensation was paid by industry to affected fishermen, and the cable landings came ashore, state law requiring their burial. So I would view this from where I sit as sort of a successful exercise in ocean resource management. It didn't happen through zoning. It happened through, if you will, a classic regulatory process in the absence of zoning. If we contemplate wave energy development, I've included then the last item in your handout. I'm skipping one. Oregon's Ocean Resources Goal 19. To me, as an ocean lawyer, this in the end represents, if you will, where current Oregon ocean law and policy in this state tends to reside. And I would emphasize the second paragraph, not the bold type, but the one immediately under it. Very broad language, but higher priority is given to the protection of renewable marine resources than to the development of non-renewable ocean resources. And in questions of offshore oil and gas development, the state has, if you will, fought hard both for state waters and federal waters off Oregon to be not explored and developed for offshore oil and gas, a non-renewable activity. The fiber optic cables, I guess we would say that's non-renewable, but conflicts were resolved and worked out. So the non-renewable cable activity comes in, fisheries are adjusted as the renewable activity, and if you will, life goes on. Interesting to contemplate about wave energy. I think we would say that's a sister renewable activity to fishing. I mean, there's hardware involved, there's platforms and facilities and cables, but on human timescales, that wave energy as a resource is renewable. And so, again, from a legal perspective, this goal is a bit indeterminate, if you will, as to which has priority. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we can work it out. I mean, that's kind of where I am right now in my personal opinion. And I guess in my second to last handout, in my pessimistic mode, I might go back to the infamous Cape Wind debacle, which from an ocean law decision-making perspective is probably our worst case scenario, happened off the New England coast, not on the West Coast. So yes, there's a possibility that there could be an adverse reaction politically and legally, and it could be executed through zoning against wave energy development. But as I say, listening carefully and doing a bit of reading as time allows, I don't yet see that as being the way that we would want to react to wave energy development. Final thoughts. I'm hopeful that the 2006 Ocean Health Agreement entered by the 3 governors on the West Coast can be used as a basis for a coordinated approach, perhaps uniform standards for wave energy development off Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. And again, it could be done through a coordinated approach, including zoning, more MPAs, more marine reserves, or it could happen without, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I would say that I think there are long-term benefits to think about more zoning in connection with wave energy development. And putting myself in the shoes of a wave energy developer, I could see additional security of tenure for the location that is developed that zoning could provide. This would be that second scenario I mentioned where we would explicitly zone in wave facilities for the indefinite future. Reduced user conflicts. It's suggested from our fisheries discussion today that yes, there will have to be an area around wave facilities with minimal activity from other users, including fishing. And so yes, just in a spatial management approach, zoning could help developers of wave energy with user conflict issues, and perhaps reduced ecological impacts as well. So, as I say, my current thought is that we should cautiously but definitely welcome wave energy to the Oregon coast, and certainly this workshop is very important in validating, if you will, kind of the assumption in my remark that ecological impacts will be relatively small or mitigatable. But if that's not true, then we will certainly have to deal with that in the process as well. So thank you very much for your attention as I walk through this attempt to meld wave energy with zoning, and I will be around tomorrow. I don't know if there'll be time tonight for any dialogue or not, but I'll leave that up to you, George.
Thank you. We do have time for some questions, but one thing that I want to mention, I was remiss in my introduction in not mentioning that today is Professor Hildreth's 64th birthday. So it's,
Thank you.
Very kind of him to come along with us on a special day. So any questions?
I was remiss in not welcoming you to Eugene. You know, this hospitality goes both ways. I'm a duck that's welcome in Corvallis and Newport, and you're certainly welcome to visit the Ocean and Coastal Law Center in Eugene anytime you can swing it.
Jen?
One question I had, is there any existing legal precedent at the state levels for who has to, take care of the cost of investigating potential impacts? 'Cause I've heard a lot of discussion of, well, it'd be great to know what was sort of there before and then measure impacts, but a lot of that stuff is somewhat costly, and I have a feeling like the state points the finger at the feds, points the finger at the applicants, and I don't know how in some of these other cases those things have been resolved or not.
Well, I'd say mostly not, but interestingly enough, I hope it's okay to talk about fisheries group deliberations today, but they tackled that very important issue as to how, for monitoring, establishing the before and after, and so forth, those costs ought to be borne. And I think one pragmatic suggestion was that, yes, some public funding will be necessary at this stage for wave and other renewables for the scientific work at the front end and the monitoring after. As I recall, these newly effective regulations of the Department of State Lands under the Oregon State Lands Board do address that issue, at least in a general way. And I think a proactive Department of State Lands could work closely with wave energy entrepreneurs to come up with realistic funding bases for both filling gaps before it happens and also monitoring after.
This is, I guess my impression about the wave energy thing is that it's quite a lot like the 1930s dams and things like that. But there were no laid out plans. There was a lot of non-information. They just went and did it. And so the funding to try to figure out what's going to happen is sort of the mode of thinking. But legally, are there sort of ways of having different levels of yes? So you can build this thing, but we don't know what's going to happen if we don't like it. We have the right to tell you to get it out.
Well, I cut short my remarks, but yes, in the absence of zoning at the federal level, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has come up with at least 2 processes for development of wave energy, and things are happening under those paths. And the Minerals Management Service, moving more slowly, probably will put in place within months, maybe a little longer, some sort of regime for the further offshore, plus work out with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, coordination and so forth. I think within their existing statutory authority, close scrutiny of possible negative impacts could be applied. But I think we've seen time and again how, within a particular legal framework on a particular legal issue, it happens or it doesn't happen. And yes, I think the hydropower situation is instructive in many ways, including the fact that it's overseen, if it's non-federal, by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is overseeing wave energy development in state waters at the federal level. And so we discovered belatedly, among other things, the impacts to anadromous fish, and we're still dealing with them as a cost of that renewable energy initiative. And hopefully, we've learned, probably the hard way with our in-river problems, how to deal with those as they show up, if they do show up, further offshore. So, as a legal analyst, I don't think I would characterize the applicable legal framework as being inadequate to deal with these things, but the implementation, or the devil is in the details down the road, about whether it happens responsibly or irresponsibly. Now, a contrary view to the one I uttered would be, we need well thought out networks of MPAs and reserves, among other things, to help support the needed science before these things happen. And as I say, I offered my personal opinion that I don't think that is necessary at this point.
On this handout with the types of activities prohibited, the last one from the Oregon State Lands, that you said is the most recent.
Yes.
It says substantially impairs lawful uses.
Mhm.
Would fishing be considered a lawful use? And so isn't that potentially a really big issue?
Sure.
This is
And
implemented now?
the term was used, again, I think I mentioned it earlier, de facto MPAs, marine protected areas. I think the Department of State Lands, in applying that performance standard to the various activities going on, will be doing, if you will, a more or less de facto decision that is like multiple use area-based management. They're going to have to assess what is going on, what are the resources, and what are the impacts possible to those resources. And again, this workshop is moving towards both gathering the information that's available and then also charting a path to get needed information as quickly as possible. So I think there's room within that new state standard to, again, as I was responding over here, to apply a close scrutiny to conflicts with uses, both renewable, like fishing, and others, even including possible non-renewable uses that are in the area. Maybe the simplest would be fiber optic cables, again, to use simple examples. We might want the transmission lines to follow corridors that are already established for fiber optic cables. That seems like a logical thing to think about. And I think state law and state management capability would help in minimizing the imposition, if you will, of no fishing areas due to these facilities that are needed. In the back.
You look at this 200-mile extension of economic zone in the first figures and recognize that there are now nation states arm wrestling over areas like the Arctic where there is no land base that goes into those areas, and that there's a value there of assets of some sort, whether they're biological or renewable wind and current sorts of things. We've got sort of a de facto ownership of some of the biological resources here by fishermen by virtue of the historic access that in our perception today is a compensationable asset to those entities if we take that away. The sense is that in creating a marine protected area or a de facto one, that demands a level of compensation. How do we look at this full spectrum from individual rights to nation states to these common areas with any sense of making a common sense of it? How are we going to do that?
Well, that's a tall order that marine law and policy scholars have been working on for at least 30 years. I would perhaps work from the specific to the more general and suggest that in moving national boundaries out to the 200-mile line, we at least created the capability to reduce those so-called tragedies of the commons in the use and overuse of ocean resources. And I think our Magnuson fishing regime has not been perfect, but it's an example then of trying to follow up on those national responsibilities with stewardship. And I think the track record is slowly getting better under the Magnuson fishery scheme, principally due, at least from a legal perspective, to the 96 amendments called the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which is the only use of sustainable that I'm aware of anywhere in federal law. Still very problematic, beyond the 200-mile national limit. And I think the Arctic could be, a watershed moment in ocean diplomacy as to whether the nations that share the Arctic can agree to restrain themselves like they did at the other pole. I guess if I were looking for a possible reason to be relatively optimistic or somewhat optimistic, it's a different circumstance politically, legally, and so forth, but Antarctica has largely, by international agreement, been set aside for either science or hopefully sustainable resource use rather than unsustainable. But it'll take some very skilled diplomacy to achieve that in time in the Arctic. So I don't know if that's helpful, Bruce, or not, but I don't see, I guess, any sort of recent breakthroughs that I would say, I would put on the table to say, oh, this is the tool that will help break the diplomatic logjam. Now, in my forthcoming article, I've taken a brief look at the movement for international marine protected areas. Right now, they tend to be within national waters. And yet, there's an NGO movement. I think I detect a movement in the science community to say we need high seas MPAs and we need them soon. So if that movement takes hold, I think it would be adaptable perhaps to the Arctic circumstance or part of it. So I don't know if that's your principal concern, but I see action elsewhere that by analogy might someday, but I'm not so optimistic about the speed of that timetable.
Don't you think the example from the Great Barrier Reef might be a good one to apply here in the sense that in that particular example, they have lots of different uses overlapping on top of each other. Somehow they seem to make it work. I sort of see the same thing happening in Oregon where you've got marine reserves coming in, potentially wave energy parks coming in, overlaid on top of that are existing uses from the fishing community, and they've been able to meld that in the example of the Great Barrier Reef. I think pretty successfully.
It's taken them, let's see, 37 years. I think the federal government of Australia came down, if you will, on the state of Queensland real hard in 1975, concerned about what was going to happen to the reef if oil and gas development occurred or sand mining increased, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, I'm glad you brought it up because frankly, I think if the reef scheme fails, we're in big trouble in the MPA world because I have given guest lectures at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. They've got a federal marine science facility focused on the reef. They have the academics at James Cook University focused on the reef. They have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority with staff and budget in Townsville focused on the reef. And as a lawyer, I say their domestic legal framework is about as good as it gets. And so if they cannot do it for the Great Barrier Reef, I think it sends a very pessimistic signal for the possibilities elsewhere. But so far, so good. And the other thing I would say, in a very open, political, and scientific process, they expanded the no-take marine reserves in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park from the historic 4% of the reef to 34%. And the federal government of Australia provided extensive compensation funds to the affected fishing fleets to help accomplish that. So, yes, I think for a Western democratic nation with a national government and states and divided authority, again, I turn to the Aussies and that approach for maybe a way through, as you were suggesting yourself. Thanks.
There's quite a bit of discussion and quite a few preliminary permit applications with FERC were filed with boundaries that sort of up the 3 nautical mile line.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see happening there? I mean, obviously MMS is not quite there with their process, and I think FERC claimed they have jurisdiction for those projects.
Mm-hmm.
Will that be the case in the future, or will that have to change somehow, or how do you see these overlapping jurisdictions?
Well, as a legal scholar, I was obviously intrigued by the FERC claim not only for jurisdiction out to 3 miles, but out to 12. And I have not yet satisfied myself as a legal scholar that there is very much of a firm basis for a FERC role beyond 3 nautical miles. And it's interesting even to contemplate moving under the Federal Power Act from the in-river situation to tidal projects in estuaries to open ocean in state waters. But I am enough of a realist, I guess I would say, that I would like to have some regime with an experienced, responsible agency that knows federal processes, providing the national perspective on wave energy development in even state ocean waters, rather than leave it without significant federal management. And I'm hopeful that for beyond 3 miles, FERC and MMS will work it out. And I guess my personal recommended solution would be to give MMS the predominant role. They already have it on the outer continental shelf for oil, gas, and minerals, and it seems like the natural demarcation point. Of course, if Congress could be interested in revisiting energy policy yet again, we might open the window to some statutory redesign. But the pace of wave energy development suggests that we not wait for that, at least again in my personal opinion.
So when you were talking about the Great Barrier Reef and you said if this fails, we're all in big trouble, it just struck me that what are the criteria for failure? Mm-hmm. And would that be a reasonable burden of proof switch mm-hmm. to say what has to happen for this to be considered a failure mm-hmm. as opposed to what we're usually worried about, which is what are the criteria for success?
Well, I guess I would offer up some very simplistic criteria, more like performance standards, but it seems to me I've been a little bit of a tourist out on the Great Barrier Reef as a snorkeler and been relatively impressed with the tourist management and, of course, huge inflow of revenues to the Queensland and federal economies from that. So there's this economic return for a sustainable approach. Now, when I was there in 1984, I think the crown of thorn starfish, this was kind of the Darth Vader that was going to eat the reef, right? At least that was the way the Brisbane newspaper portrayed it, for better or worse. And now I read that no, there are cycles with the crown of thorns, and it didn't eat the reef. We do have coral bleaching within the park and elsewhere. So no, it wouldn't be failure that the reefs decline from what I would call these external environmental factors. I'm talking more about direct human use activities, overfishing, too much tourism on sensitive reefs, et cetera, and then measurable declines that show up due to that, then I would say failure has occurred. Again, because that scheme is so thoroughly worked out from top to bottom, maps, regulations, enforcement personnel. They always could use more boats and more people, but they sort of have it all and are applying it to a key resource. And I think it's a state-of-the-art effort. And so, rightly or wrongly, I kind of seize on it in hopes that they'll keep up the good work.
Okay, well, again, thank you very much for Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, George. Yeah. Very good.